Hey guys, what's going on? I did not reach my reading goal this year. My daughter was born about a week ago, so I've been very preoccupied. Also very sleep deprived, but I still want to go through and rank all the books I read this year. We're going to go fast and loose as usual. Fast might be a little difficult, but loose will be pretty easy. Worst book I read this year, The Sands of Mars by Arthur C. Clarke. It's about some guy who goes to Mars. And that's about it. Not a lot of conflict in this book. I guess it was novel enough for a guy to just go to Mars and for Arthur C. Clarke to talk about the now commonplace aspects of space travel that I guess we all take for granted now in 2024. Next, we got Star-Lord by Louise Lawrence. This was a fine book. I don't have any negative memories of it, but I know for sure that it's going to be completely erased from my mind in a couple of years. It was E.T., almost exactly. Read kind of like daytime television. I don't know exactly what that means, but that's how I feel. Formulaic, a little basic, but it was heartfelt, so right now I am feeling kind of bad with it being that far down the list. But it is what it is. Next up, A.E. Van Vogt, The Weapon Shops of Isher. This one's probably on me. I lost the thread of this book. It's got time travel going on. It's got parallel dimensions, if I remember right. But there was some main concept about a guy who was time traveling, and there was some sort of potential energy situation going on that I lost track of. So when you lose track of a book like that and you don't understand the main conflict, then you're gonna have a bad time. I'll take the blame for that one. Next up, The Overman Culture by Edmund Cooper. This is kind of like Star-Lord in that it was a very familiar concept to me in the year 2024. So there weren't a lot of surprises. There weren't a lot of novel ideas. But I did enjoy it, and I read it in the span of a couple days. Easy breezy. Will probably be gone from my mind in the next couple of years. And also, I realized after reading this, the cover art has absolutely nothing to do with the story, which is a pet peeve of mine. You can't just put a nice piece of art on a story because you feel like it's got to have some sort of connection. Anyways, next up, and here we begin to get a lot of flack, The Stars My Destination by Alfred Bester. It was a good action story. I feel like it was overhyped. I know the main character is not supposed to be likable, but he was so insufferably unlikable that I didn't want him to succeed at all. I didn't even want to witness him turn around. It's just kind of dead on arrival for me. It was fast-paced. There were some cool, interesting ideas. And next up, we got Dracula by Bram Stoker. The less said about this, the better. I've already been crucified for my opinions on this book. I understand that this is the first Dracula. This is what spawned all those other iterations of it. But the source material was bland for me, and I did give it the antiquity bonus of having spawned all of that, but still, it was hard to get through. Next up, we got White Noise by Don DeLillo. This was described to me as Kurt Vonnegut adjacent, and it definitely is, but I don't like his handling of the material. This one specifically is a lot about death, dealing with it, living with death, even though it's all around you at all times, which it is. So it's very heavy stuff, and Vonnegut, as I've said before, manages to deliver these kind of messages in a heartfelt way where you feel better afterwards. But I feel Don DeLillo would have the ability to inflict a panic attack on you by reading this and just kind of telling you like, hey, this is a fact of life and this is how it is. And even though it's told in this absurdist way, he doesn't have the same bedside manner. He kind of just throws it at you and it's like, hey, look at this and deal with it. And he's more long-winded than Vonnegut and not nearly as funny as Vonnegut. But this book is beautiful. And I've got a few others of these. So I'll read a book just for its beauty. I'm vain. Next up is New Hampshire by Robert Frost. I feel bad that this is so low on the list. I wish I liked it better. And I do remember a few of the poems, the big ones that everybody remembers. But I have difficulties getting into poetry. And one commenter said poetry is meant to be read out loud, which I wasn't doing. So next time I try poetry, which I will, again, I'll try to read it out loud and maybe that will help me out a little bit. Next up, Real Food for Pregnancy. Bit of an outlier here. Not sure how to rank it with these, honestly, so this is kind of arbitrary. Really good book if you are trying to cook for someone who's pregnant. Very basic. These foods are good. These foods are bad. Here's why. Was never quite able to get my wife to eat liver, but we tried. Next we got On the Road by Jack Kerouac. Everybody knows about this book. It's a classic. I liked certain aspects of it and I hated others. It was kind of dry. It was definitely too long. It's about these characters who are essentially homeless, traveling the country and soaking up every morsel that the world has for them. They go to these seedy jazz clubs late at night, and then they're searching for food the next morning or searching for somewhere to sleep. They're living it up, you could say, in a way, but then they soon realize that this life is not sustainable and they have to transition. And I think they have so entrenched themselves in this lifestyle that that transition is difficult. And after having my first child, you start to look at the different stages of life and how to lead someone through those stages. And I wonder if this would be a good book to recommend to someone in college or someone freshly out of college who is living this lifestyle, because you want to warn them that, hey, you're not going to be able to do that forever, so enjoy it while it lasts. But in telling them that they can't do that forever, it kind of spoils it. Fast and Loose, Fast and Loose. Sea of Lust. Sea of Lust by Robert Cargill. That would be a different book. Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill. This is a pretty neat one about a post-apocalyptic world where AIs are battling each other. I think there are still a few humans. And it's mostly an action story with a lot of gunfight sequences that I'm not the biggest fan of. But it had an underlying philosophical layer about finding meaning in life, no matter what that looks like. Even if you're a robot that was made to bake pastries, you do ultimately create what matters in your life, which is a pretty common message, but always a welcome one. A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. I remember liking this book, but it was really hard to get into the flow of Hemingway's writing style. It's very different, it's very unique. I'm not going to say it's brilliant, but it is something. A lot of cool historical aspects here. Obviously, the antiquity bonus is huge, and you do feel like you're reading something with a lot of gravity. I know that's just built up hype around the book, and a lot of different stories have that. But mostly, I will never forgive Hemingway for how he ended this book. Ends on a really sour note, especially for someone who was in my state during the time that I read this. So it loses a couple points for that, but it was an enjoyable read. The Iron Heel by Jack London. This is an interesting dystopian book. It is late-stage capitalism, becomes more and more true every day. Apparently Jack London's nickname was Kid Communism. He was a big proponent of it, and this book reads like communist propaganda, and it is to an extent. There is a narrative woven through there, but it's kind of loose, and it definitely takes second string to the political message that he was trying to put forth. And it's a reasonable one, and it's amazing how accurate he was in describing what would happen to a society if capitalism is left unchecked or, checked in whatever manner we currently check it in. Eventually the corporations rule. Eventually the corporations have more power than the government establishments. And I just watched a video of Bernie Sanders warning us about the coming oligarchy, and by all means, he told us, he warned us right here in the bottom middle of my list of 2024 reads. Service Model by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Brand new book, came out this year, brand new as far as the overall age of these books. This is another post-apocalyptic world, and another one where robots are trying to find their way in a world that wasn't built for them. It's surprising how much sympathy you can get for a robot in one of these books, but we root for this robot as they try and find meaning in this blasted world through a bunch of different absurdist scenarios, all of which I thought were clever, all of which I liked. The ending is where I lost it for this one, kind of just throws it all against the wall, and some of it tracks and others that doesn't really agree with what you were saying back here. So it didn't stick the landing, but good book overall. Next up is one I haven't reviewed in an individual video, just read it. Slapstick by Kurt Vonnegut. As I say, the synopsis of a Vonnegut book doesn't really matter. This one's about twins who were born, and they are huge, hideous monsters, and everybody thinks they're invalids, but if they are together, they're actually geniuses. And I hate to say it about Vonnegut, and I realize I'm kind of starting to scrape the bottom of the Vonnegut barrel, but this one didn't do it for me. He was talking about the usual suspects, namely tribalism, and that any way we divide ourselves is bad. Gender, race, interests, profession, it doesn't matter. If we start dividing ourselves into anything besides human, it creates problems. He said this in every other book that he's written, and it is always a good reminder, but it just felt a little less focused in this one, a little less contained. And this was one of his later novels, and I got a comment recently that apparently Vonnegut is quoted himself saying that in his later works, he doesn't quite wrap it up into a nice ball. He kind of points you in a direction and says, yeah, the message is somewhere over there. You go find it yourself, which is exactly how I felt with Slapstick, unfortunately. The Snow Leopard by Peter Matheson. This is a heavy one. Another beautiful Penguin Orange edition, which admittedly gives it a few points. Is mostly nonfiction about a guy who's researching some sort of goat in the Himalayan mountains, and you learn that he's escaping some difficult realities that he has to face at home, trying to deal with that mostly through Zen Buddhism. So again, it's dissecting the world, it's dissecting day-to-day life. It's trying to find peace with death, it's trying to find peace with sadness and heartbreak and disappointment, because these are aspects of life, just as their opposites are. One doesn't exist without the other. Dawn by Octavia Butler. This is about a race of aliens who evolve by consuming other species. In order to advance themselves, they need to kind of suck the genes, the genetics out of other things. So obviously a parallel to slavery, and that message was received loud and clear. Other than that, it was an interesting build-up to learn about these creatures and how they communicate and how they are more or less holding our main character hostage. But it was a little slow, and then eventually, when it did get somewhere into this Hunger Games survival storyline, and it's over. So I felt a little let down, ultimately. The Masks of Time by Robert Silverberg. This is about a time traveler, maybe, who comes into the world, a world that is currently on the edge of destruction. It's kind of like a 1999 thing. People don't know if there is going to be a next year, but then this guy comes from the future, which tells them that there will be, maybe, if he's telling the truth, and you're never sure if he is. It's Robert Silverberg, so it's a page-turner, but he does manage to throw in some different philosophical ideas in there, which is what I really like about him. The Changeling by Victor Lavelle. This one is about a new father who sells books online, so you already know it's going to be a little higher on my list than maybe the average list. It's a thriller. This guy is searching for his child through the weird, fantastical underbelly of New York City. I'm pretty sure I completely spoiled it in my other review, so I won't do the same here, but it's an inward journey, and it's about trying to break childhood traumas, which is another thing I am looking at currently in my life. Dune by Frank Herbert. Finally read this one this year. Did live up to the hype, I will say. Ultimately dragged in the middle, but got me hooked at the beginning and definitely got me excited to read more. Perhaps I will before the next movie comes out. Planet of Exile by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a nice little fantasy escape to another winter world like Left Hand of Darkness. There's two different races on this planet. One was put there in order to research the other, but then they all got trapped. It's a kind of Game of Thrones thing where winter comes every year and throws everything into chaos. There's snow ghouls. I don't know, they weren't really an aspect of the story, but I remember liking just the term snow ghouls. Nothing really monumental here. It's Ursula K. Le Guin. I love her writing. I do like fantasy, but I have a hard time getting through all of the huge multi-tome series that fantasy is generally delivered in. So this was a nice change of pace. Would recommend that to anyone. Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. I read In Cold Blood last year. Absolutely loved it. I think it was in my top 3 books of the year. So I figured I'd try Truman Capote's other big book out, and it delivered again. It was the same kind of formula where he shows you a extremely unlikable main character. In this one, a little less unlikable, not a cold-blooded murderer, but a vapid, vain woman who's living outside of her means, very judgmental, very shallow. And he starts off that way. And then through the book, he gets you to actually like this character, which is quite a feat in both of these books. Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers. This one came highly recommended. You probably already know what it's about. A zone of the world that has been desecrated by some kind of alien visitation. They left behind a lot of weird relics that people go in and obtain through inflicting great dangers upon themselves. We follow one of these stalkers as he goes in and out of the zone. This one was definitely clunky. It was a little hard to get through at times. And it's one of those books where when it hits you, it hits you. There's this one moment, at least for me, when it all comes clicking together. And I gotta believe that's why it comes so highly recommended, because so many people have that aha moment at that one time, and that's what kind of creates this big memory, this lasting memory in you, where you gotta remember Roadside Picnic because it gave you that feeling at that one page in the book, even though it might have been a little tough to get there. Thorns by Robert Silverberg. Are we up to 10 yet? That was number 10. Roadside Picnic, number 10. Number 9, Thorns by Robert Silverberg. Again, I love anything by this guy. Everything he writes is a page-turner. This one's about a futuristic Jerry Springer who creates these reality television shows. They're all designed to create discomfort and misery and then broadcast out into the world for everyone else to consume, as we do here in this world today. And I was rooting for those two characters more than I think I've ever rooted for any character in any book. I wanted them to succeed. Was I disappointed? I won't spoil it. Read it for yourself. It's a good book. Number 8, A Maze of Death by Philip K. Dick. You already know what you're getting into when you pick up a PKD. He's got paranoia. He's got misconceptions. You don't know what's real. You don't know what's fake. I always wonder what this guy would be like if he was alive today, because his nightmares have come true. You can't trust anything that you see. All the information delivered to you has been funneled through a bunch of different channels. We're all living in PKD's mind right now. This is how he felt, not being able to trust anything. And it is frustrating. I get it. I sympathize with the guy. Behold the Man by Michael Moorcock. Time travel story about someone going back to see what really happened with Jesus. One of those that's told two stories in tandem. One is the time travel bit, and one is the main character before, understanding who he is, how he got to the point that he did. And I found myself sympathizing a lot with him, relating a lot to him. Just a well put together novella. My first Michael Moorcock. I will go back for more. Although I know he writes a lot of fantasy, so I hope there's more of these kind of books that I can find out there. Number 6, Blood Music by Greg Bear. This is a page-turner for sure. A very weird kind of alien invasion story. It spans a lot of different genres. I think I remember saying if you don't like what you're reading, just wait 10 pages and it'll be something else. It takes a lot of sharp turns. It's a pretty long book, but I bet you can read it in a sitting. At least you'd want to read it in a sitting. And one that you could recommend to probably anybody. If you're trying to give a gift to somebody who reads, give them Blood Music, they'd probably like it. Even if they read, you know, like James Patterson, Brad Thor, kind of general thrillers, this would probably be in their ballpark. Might expand their horizons a little bit. All right, number 5. This was when I was going to bring in our special guest, but I don't want to bring in our special guest when I'm talking about I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. A very brutal book. I'm a big fan of Matheson. I find it interesting that a lot of people read for escapism. So generally, you write for escapism. You write for people that want to get away from the world. But Richard Matheson kind of does the opposite. He puts you in this fictional setting, but he doesn't allow you to escape the harsh realities of life. This is a zombie book or a vampire book, either one. The words are kind of interchangeable here. It's about a guy who's barely hanging on. He drinks all the time. That's the only way he gets by. And I'm trying to find a way to brighten up this synopsis, but it only gets darker. Richard Matheson must have been a very lonely soul, but he writes a compelling book. And I got to admit, I do like to wallow in that harsh reality style that he has. something oddly, probably dangerously satisfying in it. Number 4, Some of Your Blood by Theodore Sturgeon. Here's a surprise one. Short little novella. The most accurate vampire origin story that I've ever read. It could be real. It starts off with a military report about a guy who I believe was discharged or at least seen doing something odd. And it kind of plants that question in your brain right at the beginning. What's going on here? And then it goes into his backstory and some other characters' backstories and kind of piece by piece shows you what's happening. And I didn't see it coming. A page turner for sure. And a book I haven't heard anything else about. So it was nice to go into it without any preconceptions and to find a really good story there. Okay, we're into the top 3 here. And now we will bring in our special guest. All right, the magic of editing skipped over a particularly grisly diaper change. And we have Violet here for our top 3 books. What's the favorite book you read this year? Really? Be nice when I can actually ask her that question. Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham, number 3. I love a good zombie story, and this is one with plants as the zombies. There's an eclipse that happens, everybody's looking up at the sky, and they go blind, which allows these plants to rapidly climb up the evolutionary ladder so that they can take advantage of these humans who are just stumbling around in this quickly found dystopia where no one can get food anymore and everybody's reliant upon the handful of people who weren't looking at the eclipse. Great concept, great beginning to a story, and it delivers. It was written in the 50s, but it has a really quick pace. There's no glaring societal roadblocks, if you know what I mean. Just a good story. Really enjoyed it. Number 2, here's a surprise, Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. Bradbury is usually a little too cheesy for me, but this one really hit the mark. Dandelion wine refers to the drink that they would make every year with the dandelions that came up in their yard. They would turn it into wine, and then in their cellar, they'd have a bunch of different jars that kind of embodied the essence of every summer. So these 2 kids try and do their best to encapsulate each summer like the wine. And it ends up with a pretty deep story about one of the boys going through their first existential crisis, dealing with what Bradbury calls the lonely man. And I've kind of taken that moniker myself when you're dealing with something and you kind of feel the presence of the lonely man with you in the room. And it kind of gives a face to it, it gives an essence to it, something that we're all gonna have to face one day, and we see this one boy dealing with it for the first time in a very heartfelt way, a very emotional way. So Bradbury, sorry I've made fun of you in the past. You hit the mark there. And my favorite book of the year is The Manticore by Robertson Davies. I think it was my favorite book at the midpoint of the year as well. It is the second book in the Deptford trilogy, starting with Fifth Business. And it continues this man's quest of self-discovery. He goes to Geneva to a world-renowned psychologist after the events of the first novel, which leave him traumatized in a couple of different ways. And he goes to do battle with his trolls in a Carl Jung-inspired way. And I really like that concept of doing battle with your trolls, going into your brain and finding the undeveloped aspects, the manticore aspects, which have weird characteristics of different origin because you haven't looked at them enough, you haven't analyzed them enough, and they're whipping their barbed tail around and causing havoc in your brain. And I think that's the cause for a lot of sadness and a lot of cruelty in the world is unresolved personal trauma. Everybody has it, myself included, and it's because you just don't take the time to look at it and analyze it and try and figure out what it is and how to deal with it. And especially with the recent occurrences in my life, I'm doing my best to do battle with my own trolls and make sure that their stones don't get thrown out of my brain into other people's brains, related to me or otherwise. A great message, and one I would recommend to anybody. It is a little heavy, it is a little reference material-y, but a great story and a great message. And my favorite book of the year. So that's what I got for you today. Like I said in my last video, not sure how frequent these videos will be. I am trying my best to continue to read. I have 2 more that I haven't reviewed yet. So in all likelihood, there will be a video soon. See you then. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.